Imagine descending into water so cold it should be solid, into a cathedral carved not by human hands but by the slow, relentless retreat of ice that has stood for millennia. The Arctic Ocean is transforming before our eyes, losing 13% of its frozen surface every decade, melting at a pace unprecedented in human history. Beneath the fractured ice shelves, where sunlight now penetrates waters that knew only darkness for millions of years, marine biologists have discovered something that defies every timeline evolution should follow. Strange organisms are appearing in these newly opened zones, creatures bearing anatomical features that typically require hundreds of thousands of years to develop, yet they have emerged within mere decades. What could possibly accelerate the machinery of life itself, turning the slow grind of natural selection into an explosive sprint? The polar oceans, once frozen in evolutionary stasis, have become laboratories of transformation so rapid that scientists can barely document the changes before new ones appear. These are the ghost zones, vast underwater territories suddenly thrust from timeless isolation into the chaos of the modern ocean. And in their depths, something ancient is awakening at a speed that should be impossible. The discovery began innocuously enough, with routine surveys of Arctic waters that had been locked beneath ice shelves for over 100,000 years. Research vessels navigating through channels that did not exist a generation ago started pulling up organisms in their nets that appeared in no taxonomic database, creatures that seemed caught between what they were and what they were becoming. A species of amphipod with partially formed bioluminescent organs, structures that in related species took millions of years of adaptation to deep-sea environments. Fish displaying antifreeze proteins in configurations never before documented, as if nature were experimenting with different chemical solutions in real time. Most disturbing were the transitional forms, organisms that appeared to be evolving before researchers could even establish what their baseline characteristics should be. How do you classify something that might be fundamentally different by the time your paper reaches peer review? The temporal disconnect was unsettling, like watching a time-lapse video of evolution, except this was happening in normal time, in real ecological systems, with living creatures transforming at a pace that violated every understood mechanism of genetic change. Scientists aboard research stations found themselves cataloging not species, but snapshots of species in flux. The ghost zones themselves present an environment unlike any other on Earth, a bizarre intersection of ancient isolation and sudden violent exposure to the modern world. For millions of years, these waters existed in near-total darkness beneath kilometers of ice, their ecosystems evolving in isolation, developing strange adaptations to perpetual cold and permanent night. Then, within the span of human decades, the ice retreated and sunlight flooded in, bringing with it warmth, oxygen, nutrients from melting glaciers, and the invasion of species from temperate waters. The organisms that had adapted to the old conditions found themselves in an alien world, subjected to environmental pressures so extreme that only the most adaptable survived. But survival alone does not explain what researchers are witnessing. The creatures emerging from these zones are not merely adapted versions of what came before. They are something fundamentally new, displaying traits that suggest access to genetic possibilities that should not be available so quickly. What lurks in the DNA of these organisms that allows such rapid metamorphosis? Is there some hidden evolutionary toolkit, dormant genetic switches waiting for precisely this kind of catastrophic environmental shift to unlock? Temperature measurements from the ghost zones reveal water layers stratified in ways that create microenvironments of astonishing variety within relatively small areas. In one region, you might find water at -1.8 degrees Celsius, the freezing point of seawater, sitting directly above a layer warmed to 4 degrees by deep currents, with meltwater at 0.5 degrees flowing between them like a living membrane. These thermal boundaries become evolutionary frontiers, zones where organisms must adapt to multiple temperature regimes simultaneously or face extinction. The selective pressure is immense, winnowing populations with ruthless efficiency, but it is also incredibly specific, favoring traits that allow rapid physiological adjustment rather than slow genetic drift. Researchers have documented fish moving between these layers multiple times per day, their metabolism somehow adjusting to temperature swings that would kill most temperate species within hours. The energetic cost should be prohibitive, yet these creatures thrive, suggesting metabolic innovations that science has not yet identified. Could the ghost zones be acting as evolutionary accelerators, pressure cookers where adaptation happens not across generations but within individual lifespans, with successful changes somehow being passed to offspring? The implications would rewrite fundamental biology. Light, too, plays a stranger role than expected in these newly exposed waters, creating conditions that blend perpetual twilight with sudden brilliant illumination depending on ice cover and time of year. During polar summer, the sun never sets, bathing the ghost zones in constant light for months, while winter plunges them back into total darkness for equal periods. Organisms that evolved in permanent darkness now face 6 months of continuous daylight, an assault on photosensitive systems that never needed to filter or process light. Some species have begun developing eye structures at unprecedented rates, with juvenile stages showing progressively more complex visual organs with each generation. Others have gone the opposite direction, losing eyes entirely but gaining new sensory systems that detect chemical gradients or electrical fields with extraordinary precision. The evolutionary experimentation is happening in parallel across multiple lineages, as if the ghost zones are running dozens of adaptive trials simultaneously. Which solutions will prove successful remains unknown, but the variety of approaches suggests that these ecosystems are in a state of creative chaos, throwing every possible mutation at the wall to see what sticks. The survivors of this lottery will inherit an ocean utterly transformed. Perhaps most unnerving is the genetic analysis emerging from laboratories studying tissue samples from ghost zone organisms, data that challenges comfortable assumptions about how evolution proceeds. Standard mutation rates, the background ticking of genetic change that serves as evolution's clock, appear elevated far beyond normal ranges in many species. Some researchers have documented mutation frequencies 10 to 50 times higher than baseline, rates that should be lethal, overwhelming organisms with deleterious changes faster than selection can eliminate them. Yet instead of genetic meltdown, these populations are thriving, suggesting that something is buffering them against the usual costs of rapid mutation, perhaps through enhanced DNA repair mechanisms or increased genetic redundancy that allows experimentation without fatal consequences. Even more mysteriously, some of the new traits appearing in these creatures involve genes that have no apparent ancestry in their lineage, genetic sequences that seem to have arrived horizontally, transferred from entirely unrelated organisms. Viruses and bacteria in the meltwater, freed from ancient ice, might be acting as genetic vectors, shuttling DNA between species in ways that terrestrial ecosystems rarely experience. If true, the ghost zones are not just accelerating evolution, they are fundamentally changing the rules, allowing organisms to borrow solutions from across the tree of life. The timeline of these changes compounds the mystery, because the ice has been retreating in earnest for only a few decades, an evolutionary eye blink. From the 1980s until now, over 10,000 cubic kilometers of Arctic sea ice have vanished, an almost incomprehensible loss that has opened vast new territories to biological colonization. The organisms appearing in these spaces cannot be relicts from previous warm periods. Genetic analysis confirms they are derived from existing Arctic species, yet they display innovations that should require geological timescales to evolve. Are we witnessing the power of extreme selective pressure to reveal hidden variation within genomes? Traits that existed as recessive or suppressed genes suddenly finding utility in radically altered environments? Or is something more fundamental occurring, a kind of evolutionary phase transition where the normal gradual accumulation of change gives way to rapid systemic reorganization? The ghost zones offer no easy answers, only more questions that grow stranger the deeper researchers look. Every expedition returns with organisms that do not quite fit existing categories, creatures that seem to exist in the spaces between established taxonomy, living question marks swimming through waters that were solid ice when today's scientists were children. Yet for all the wonder these discoveries inspire, an undercurrent of dread runs through the research community, because what is emerging in the ghost zones may be only the beginning of something far larger and more unsettling. If evolution can move this quickly under the right conditions, what happens when those conditions spread beyond the polar regions, when warming oceans and shifting currents export this accelerated change to temperate and tropical waters? The organisms evolving in the Arctic are adapting to survive, but their very existence suggests that stable ecosystems everywhere are more fragile than we believed, that the careful balance of species and environments can shatter and reassemble in radically new configurations within human lifetimes. And if new life is exploding into existence in the ghost zones, what is dying to make room for it? The cameras and sensors descending into Arctic waters capture births, but every birth implies a death. Every new adaptation a species that could not change fast enough. To understand what is awakening beneath the melting ice, we must first bear witness to what is vanishing, to the extinction cascade already underway in waters that are warming faster than evolution can save everything they contain. There is a particular horror in watching something die slowly, and nowhere is this more apparent than in the collapsing ecosystems of the polar oceans, where ice-dependent species face not gradual decline but catastrophic disintegration. The Arctic has lost over 30% of its summer sea ice extent since satellite records began in 1979, with minimum coverage now consistently below levels observed before 2007, a threshold that once seemed unthinkable. Each year, the ice retreats further, faster, leaving behind species that evolved over millions of years to survive in conditions that no longer exist. Polar cod, the foundational fish species of Arctic food webs, require sea ice to shelter their larvae and provide the algae-rich underside habitat where juveniles feed and grow. Without this frozen nursery, entire year classes fail, populations crash, and the predators that depend on them face starvation. Ringed seals, the most ice-dependent marine mammal, need stable platforms for birthing dens where pups spend their first vulnerable weeks. As ice becomes thinner and more transient, dens collapse, pups drown or freeze, and birth rates plummet across the Arctic basin. Can a species survive when its very habitat is melting beneath it? The polar oceans are providing the answer, and it is written in the silence of vanishing populations. The concept scientists have begun calling thermal refugees captures the desperation of organisms fleeing warming waters, seeking the last pockets of cold in an ocean that no longer offers sanctuary. As surface temperatures rise, cold-adapted species migrate toward the poles and into deeper waters, following the shrinking envelope of conditions they can tolerate. But the Arctic has no further north to offer, and depth provides only temporary refuge before organisms encounter the limits of pressure tolerance or food availability. The result is a geographic compression, hundreds of species forced into ever smaller cold water zones, creating density levels that ecosystems were never designed to support. Imagine an entire ocean's worth of refugees compressed into fragments of their former range, predators and prey jammed together in impossible proximity, competition for resources escalating beyond anything natural selection prepared them for. The thermal refuges become pressure cookers of ecological stress, zones where normal behavioral patterns break down and survival becomes a desperate lottery. Bottom-dwelling species that once ranged across vast territories find themselves competing for limited seafloor in the few remaining cold zones. Fish that evolved careful spacing and territorial behaviors are forced into unnaturally dense schools where disease spreads rapidly and aggression escalates. What happens in these overcrowded refuge zones defies the usual dynamics of predator-prey relationships, creating scenarios that marine biologists describe with barely concealed unease. Predatory species that would normally avoid each other due to territorial instincts are forced to hunt the same shrinking pools of prey, sometimes in direct visual contact, tension crackling through the water. Prey species that rely on spatial distribution to avoid predation find themselves concentrated in killing fields where escape is geometrically impossible. The refuge zones develop what researchers call predation saturation, conditions where predators encounter prey at rates far exceeding normal hunting success, leading to localized collapse of prey populations followed inevitably by predator starvation. Seabirds diving into these zones find easy fishing at first, the water thick with desperate fish, but return weeks later to find the abundance gone, the refuge emptied by a feeding frenzy that could not sustain itself. It is evolution in reverse, survival of the fittest replaced by simple probability in confined spaces where even the most adapted organisms cannot overcome the mathematics of overcrowding. The thermal refuges promise survival but deliver only slower death, a false hope that concentrates populations for easier extinction. Yet perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this extinction cascade is not the deaths themselves but what is happening to the survivors in the final generations before local populations wink out. Field researchers documenting declining species have begun reporting observations that challenge comfortable notions of how organisms respond to terminal stress, mutations and deformities appearing at frequencies far beyond background rates. Polar cod with asymmetric body plans, one side developing normally while the other shows stunted growth. Ice algae displaying cellular structures that appear almost experimental, as if the organisms were trying multiple survival strategies simultaneously within single individuals. Amphipods with malformed exoskeletons that nevertheless manage to survive and reproduce, passing their strange morphologies to offspring who display even more extreme variations. Are these simply the visible signs of populations under extreme stress, genetic quality control breaking down as selective pressure overwhelms normal developmental safeguards? Or could something else be occurring, a kind of evolutionary desperation where organisms throw every possible mutation at a rapidly changing environment, a biological Hail Mary that sacrifices individual fitness? The collapse of ice algae communities represents perhaps the most foundational disruption, a removal of the very base of polar food webs that reverberates through every trophic level. These microscopic organisms live on the underside of sea ice, forming dense mats in the interface between frozen and liquid water, harvesting sunlight that penetrates the ice above and nutrients from the water below. Their productivity is immense, supporting the zooplankton that feed juvenile fish, which feed larger fish, which feed seals, which feed polar bears, an energy pipeline that begins with single-celled organisms clinging to ice. As the ice disappears, so do the algae, and with them the entire ecological architecture they support. Scientists measuring primary productivity in newly ice-free Arctic waters find it dramatically reduced compared to ice-covered zones. The open water unable to replicate the unique conditions that made the ice algae interface so productive. The water becomes clearer, less green, beautiful in a sterile way that signals the absence of the microscopic life that should cloud it. Zooplankton populations follow the algae into decline, their seasonal blooms becoming smaller and more erratic, mismatched with the needs of larval fish whose hatching times are controlled by temperature, but whose feeding depends on plankton availability that no longer arrives on schedule. Seabirds provide perhaps the most visible and emotionally wrenching evidence of ecosystem collapse, their colonies facing catastrophic breeding failures as the ocean beneath them empties. Species like the little auk, which nest in massive colonies in the high Arctic and depend on zooplankton blooms to feed their chicks, are experiencing unprecedented reproductive collapse, with some colonies seeing 90% or greater chick mortality in recent years. Parent birds fly longer and longer foraging trips, searching for food in an ocean that no longer provides the dense swarms of prey they evolved to exploit. Chicks starve in their nests, too weak to fledge, while exhausted adults continue hunting in waters too warm and too poor to support them. The colonies, once numbering in the millions and creating a din of calls that could be heard kilometers away, are becoming quieter each year, the silence itself a measure of loss that no graph can capture. How do you quantify the absence of life, the missing calls and empty nests that once buzzed with frantic activity? The seabird colonies are becoming monuments to what was, and their silence speaks louder than any scientific paper detailing population trends and mortality rates. The speed of this collapse compounds its horror, because evolutionary adaptation requires time that these species simply do not have, the environment changing faster than genetics can respond. Species adapted to stable polar conditions evolved slowly over millions of years, their physiologies finely tuned to cold water, seasonal ice cover, and the particular food webs these conditions create. Such specialization, advantageous in stable environments, becomes a death sentence when conditions shift rapidly, leaving organisms locked into requirements for habitats that no longer exist. A polar cod cannot simply decide to tolerate warmer water or change its breeding strategy to survive without sea ice. Such transformations would require genetic changes that take thousands of generations to accumulate and refine. But the ice is disappearing within decades, a pace that makes adaptation essentially impossible for long-lived, slow-reproducing species. The mathematics are brutal and unforgiving, rate of environmental change divided by generation time multiplied by genetic variation. And for many polar specialists the equation yields zero, no pathway to survival exists within the time remaining. Even species showing signs of adaptation in the ghost zones are the exceptions. The vast majority of ice-dependent organisms are simply dying, unable to evolve fast enough to keep pace with the ocean's transformation. Yet nature abhors a vacuum, and even as native polar species spiral toward extinction, other organisms are moving north, following the warming water into territories that were recently too cold to support them. Temperate fish species, opportunistic invertebrates, even certain algae and plankton from southern waters are expanding their ranges poleward at rates of tens of kilometers per year, ecological pioneers colonizing the Arctic as ice barriers melt away. These invaders do not simply fill empty niches left by declining natives. They transform the ecosystems they enter, bringing new competitive pressures, predation strategies, and diseases to which polar species have no evolved defenses. The Arctic Ocean is experiencing an invasion on multiple fronts simultaneously, a biological blitzkrieg that exploits the vulnerability of stressed native populations. Some of these invaders are thriving in ways that suggest the warming Arctic may suit them better than their original temperate homes, growing faster, larger, reproducing more successfully in waters rich with nutrients and relatively poor in competitors. And strangest of all, some of these colonizing species are themselves changing upon arrival, adapting to polar conditions with unsettling speed, as if the Arctic waters themselves catalyze transformation in organisms ready to exploit the vacuum left by extinction. A silent invasion is unfolding beneath the drifting ice, as the boundaries that once separated cold from warmth, native from foreign, begin to dissolve in the warming polar oceans. Gone is the notion that these waters represent a static, unchanging final frontier. Instead, they have become a living laboratory where temperate species arrive with astonishing frequency, each wave bringing new and often unpredictable changes. Marine biologists, far from welcoming a simple exchange of life forms, watch in amazement and trepidation as southern invaders not only survive upon arrival but transform visibly, adapting to the harshness of their new world at a pace formerly deemed impossible. The most striking early arrivals are Atlantic cod and mackerel, fish traditionally confined to temperate seas, now seen in growing numbers north of Svalbard and deep into the Barents Sea, venturing farther with each passing year. Bottom dwellers like decorator crabs creep steadily from the Pacific northward, invading the Chukchi and Beaufort Seas, while crustaceans and mollusks once foreign to these waters test their fortunes in the Arctic's strange, mixed currents. Have the ancient regulators of life in the polar sea been permanently unseated, or is this just another transient fluctuation? Each new arrival seems to rewrite the rules anew, adding fuel to the uncertain, accelerating blaze of change. But this isn't migration in the ordinary sense. These aren't simple travelers, unchanged by their journey. Instead, scientists observe what they've named the polar modification effect, a phenomenon where migrating species rapidly develop features better suited for icy darkness and shifting salinity. Squid populations, for example, are recorded doubling in size throughout their first winters after arrival, their metabolism and growth rates spiking far beyond what southern relatives display. Atlantic mackerel entering high Arctic waters begin to express antifreeze proteins similar to those found in native polar cod, allowing them to remain active and hunt deep into the cold season. Even jellyfish, floating in dense, glowing colonies through once glacier-choked fjords, shift their hunting tactics, synchronizing bloom patterns to the brief, luminous Arctic summer. What could trigger such a spectrum of innovations across such disparate lineages so quickly? Researchers debate whether the answer lies in hidden genetic potential, chance hybridization with local species, or a yet undiscovered biochemical process unleashed by extreme environmental stress. Nowhere is the invasion felt more forcefully than along the shifting borders of what biologists call the hybrid zones, those watery frontiers where native and newcomer meet and, in the chaos of ecological upheaval, sometimes merge into something altogether new. In these mixing grounds, the normally clear lines between species break down. Hybrid fish display colorations and hunting behaviors unknown in either parent population, while crustaceans display strange, intermediate morphologies. Observers have documented bizarre forms, anomalously pigmented gadoids, shrimp with the robust claws and spined carapaces of invasive relatives, polychaete worms acquiring unpredictable patterns of segmentation and bristling limbs. These creatures don't fit neatly into any category, thwarting identification, perplexing geneticists with DNA mosaics. Is nature improvising, driven by crisis to cross once impassable genetic borders? What ecological role might these hybrids carve out within an already destabilizing system? For now, they haunt the Arctic twilight, living evidence that the old evolutionary rules have become mere suggestions. But the transformation does not stop at individual species. It ripples outward, altering entire ecological webs while the world struggles to keep pace with the latest findings. Shellfish populations that once flourished quietly at select thermal boundaries must now contend with swarms of predatory southern crabs that outcompete native species for food and shelter. Where native amphipods and ice shrimps once ruled the seafloor, carnivorous invaders like the red king crab reshape benthic communities, consuming indiscriminately and disrupting nutrient cycles that have persisted for thousands of years. Algal blooms, stoked by warming waters and longer growing seasons, alter water chemistry and oxygen levels, with unpredictable consequences for both new and old inhabitants. Instead of a stable ecosystem gradually warming, the polar ocean now resembles a vast, unending experiment, one in which the outcome is perilously uncertain and the rules are rewritten each season. For scientists, documenting these unfolding dramas is as much a test of nerve as of curiosity. Each season, expedition trawls fill with unfamiliar forms, many still unnamed. Each analysis uncovers genetic signatures that hint at multilineal ancestry or sudden evolutionary leaps. Some laboratory teams have begun to report an uptick in rare or previously unrecorded parasites, suggesting that the invaders arrive not alone, but as microbe-carrying voyagers capable of igniting disease outbreaks in populations unprepared for such threats. Is this surge in pathogens a fluke, or an inevitable side effect of ecological boundaries dissolving under climate change? Meanwhile, the very speed of adaptation in invaders provokes anxious speculation. Are we observing the emergence of entirely new lineages, the birth of future dominant species? Or is this a desperate, unsustainable surge biology in perpetual emergency, with a long, devastating crash waiting just around the next decade? In the waters beneath broken flows and in the chill, murky trenches where southern and northern life now collide, the struggle is simultaneously physical and genetic. Invaders compete fiercely, outswimming and outgrowing their counterparts, but they also mix genetically in ways that disassemble old identities and create evolutionary possibilities never before sampled by natural selection. Here, mackerel and cod spawn in new breeding grounds, producing offspring that inherit the best of both cold tolerance and southern aggression. There, jellyfish and ctenophores form unruly superswarms, whose impact on local plankton reverberates upward through the food web. What new monsters, what ecological leviathans might be emerging in these contested waters? Each year closes some doors in the genetic library forever but opens new, unpredictable chapters, storylines no scientist or storyteller could have scripted merely a decade ago. The invasion is driven not only by warming waters and broken ice barriers but by the machinery of global trade and shifting currents. Ballast water discharged by ships, spores and larvae attached to fishing gear, the long shadow of aquaculture. These all act as highways, accelerating the arrival of southern species that once could never reach the poles. Human fingerprints are everywhere. In the compounded invasions, in the accelerating mixing of biotas, in the mysterious speed with which the Arctic's ecological face is replaced by strange new likenesses. As the process unfolds, one uneasy question gathers weight. Are we witnessing the beginning of a new, robust and dynamic polar ecology, or the prelude to ecological breakdown? For every sign of adaptation or hybrid vigor, there is an equally chilling marker of instability. A crash in native abundance, a shelf suddenly barren where life once thrived, an outbreak of disease or parasite cascading through populations till nothing remains but silence. It is likely that the most dramatic transformations remain unseen, playing out at microbial and genetic levels invisible to human eyes. Deep within the invaded Arctic waters, hybridization and selection, stress and opportunity intermingle in unpredictable patterns, birthing lineages poised on the edge of what our definitions of natural can encompass. Evolution, once conceived as stately and gradual, is fracturing into fragments of feverish experimentation, scenes as thrilling as they are faintly terrifying. What new histories are being written beneath the vanishing ice, and what unsuspected dangers or marvels might yet emerge from this living crucible? Here at the invasion front, the answers remain tantalizingly out of reach, wrapped in darkness, awaiting revelation in the seasons to come. Only one thing is certain. In these shifting waters, The Arctic story is no longer just about loss, but about the unsettling, unceasing surge of the unknown. In the newly exposed polar shelves, where the ice has retreated to reveal stark blue water and craggy channels, a vibrant explosion of life unfolds. A spectacle both wondrous and disturbing to those who witness it. What was once an icy desert, home only to specialist survivors, has become the planet's most dynamic evolutionary hotspot, a realm where adaptation and mutation crowd the timeline. As sunlight bathes these waters for the first time in millennia, algae and plankton bloom in thick, green clouds, setting off a chain reaction of biological innovation. Warmed by glacier runoff and fed by ancient minerals released from melting permafrost, these waters nurture life forms in such profusion and novelty that even seasoned scientists confess to awe. Within months of ice retreat, filter-feeding giants, immense, ghostly jellyfish species, form drifting curtains over the dark, cold seafloor, sweeping up plankton with pulsing, diaphanous arms. Among them, strange crustaceans with impossibly thick, armor-like shells prowl the undercurrents, their surfaces gleaming from ultraviolet-toughened exoskeletons. These armored hunters are both a testament to evolution's inventiveness and a warning about the harsh new rules of survival. Yet, the eerie beauty of this nursery belies attention. Something invisible and urgent fuels this whirlwind of change. The earnest observers aboard research vessels, trawling through these blooming ecosystems, find themselves inundated with organisms that barely resemble standard classifications. The newly named meltwater ambush predators, for example, bear the sharp, elongated forms of traditional fish but are marked by spectral patches of bioluminescence, flashing in rhythm with the motion of shadow and current. These creatures dart in and out of shallow ice-carved tunnels, using their luminescent lures to draw prey close before launching precision strikes. Juvenile forms adapt with astonishing speed. One generation may differ significantly from the next, as traits that work best in the teeming, unstable landscape become dominant almost overnight. Leading scientists question whether this is simply accelerated natural selection, or if some deeper, less understood mechanism is at play in these volatile margins. What ancient genetic toolkits lie dormant, waiting for a world of chaos and opportunity to awaken them into action? This crucible of transformation is not limited to the obvious predators and filter feeders. Hidden among colossal strands of melting ice are blooms of new invertebrate forms, the kind that spark both fascination and a shudder of unease. Massive, translucent sea cucumbers, nearly a meter long, their skin laced with intricate patterns of blue and violet, slide silently along the seafloor, digesting nutrient-choked mud and excreting ribbons of life-sustaining waste. Many harbor symbiotic bacteria never cataloged by science, forming miniature ecosystems within their own bodies. Floating just above, planktonic colonies, perhaps the ancestors of future reef builders, link arms in living chains, exploiting the perpetual dusk to maximize every flicker of available sunlight. The sheer unpredictability of what might emerge next gives these shelves an atmosphere of suspense. Every net deployed to sample the water is liable to return a creature no scientist can name. In the endless dusk beneath thinning ice, evolution writes a story of test and error at a frantic, feverish pace. As ecologists sift through their haul, genetic sequencing reveals a disconcerting phenomenon. In pockets they label acceleration zones, mutation rates soar far beyond what classic population genetics predicts for even the most stressed environments. Here, evolutionary time seems to unspool twice as rapidly. Traits like cold tolerance, predator-repelling toxins, or UV-hardened pigment emerge in just a few generations. Comparison with data from more stable regions hints at something stranger than simple adaptation. Are viruses and ancient microbial hitchhikers, once long entombed in ice, acting as wildcards that shuffle DNA among species with reckless abandon? Some cases reveal genetic sequences in predators that were previously attributed only to distant plankton, transfers so unlikely they defy easy explanation. What forces, visible only at the genomic level, are turning these ice-free margins into the most volatile natural laboratories on Earth? The rapidity of change exacts costs as well as provides opportunity. Some new titans flourish monumentally only to succumb just as quickly, their populations peaking and crashing within a handful of seasons. Bizarre bloom events. Swarms of oversized jellyfish or flexible, snake-like filter feeders rise to dominance, smothering competitors and monopolizing resources until environmental conditions, just as abruptly, shift again. These cyclical die-offs fuel the next surge of diversity, flooding the ecosystem with organic material that sustains opportunists waiting in the wings. Predators fatten on such abundance, themselves adapting, teeth becoming longer and more recurved, hunting strategies moving from solitary ambush to coordinated pack maneuvers. Every feast is followed by an equally dramatic famine, transforming the nurseries into arenas of constant survival drama. How far can nature push its inventiveness before the engine of mutation runs too hot? Ecosystem mapping reveals that the rise of armored crustaceans and bioluminescent predators coincides with a shift in the microbial world. A subtler, yet no less consequential, evolutionary upheaval. Bacterial mats, formerly confined to seafloor seeps, begin to colonize surfaces beneath melting shelves, secreting chemical shields and altering the nutrient flows that underpin higher life. Some microbes turn toxic, creating microhabitats that only the most chemically robust species can tolerate, while others form life-supporting symbioses with invertebrate giants. Intriguingly, these microrealms often serve as incubation sites for embryonic fish and crustaceans, suggesting that the evolutionary arms race stretches from the visible to the microscopic, amplifying both opportunity and peril. In this living mosaic, the borders between species, role, and strategy are in constant flux, reminding us how little we truly understand about the business of becoming. Yet the mystery that grips many researchers runs deeper than the cycle of flourishing and collapse. Some returning expeditions report observing behaviors and morphologies not merely unprecedented, but apparently borrowed wholesale from unrelated creatures. Octopuses displaying the glow of deep-sea anglerfish, worms with the coordinated swarming tactics of pelagic shrimp. Theories abound. Perhaps horizontal gene transfer, catalyzed by viruses or stress, is functioning on a scale never previously seen in marine settings. Or maybe chemical cues from meltwater itself trigger bursts of developmental plasticity, unlocking dormant genes suppressed for eons. Whatever the mechanism, these sudden leaps create organisms that appear to blend several evolutionary lineages, combining predatory efficiency, environmental toughness, and haunting beauty. In the shadowed nursery of the Thaw, the line between miracle and monster becomes breathtakingly thin. What will become of these feverish experiments in survival? Will some of these new titans anchor the next stable food web, or are they merely ephemeral wonders, destined to vanish when the next environmental jolt arrives? As scientists return to sample the same shelf year after year, they bear witness to an unsettling truth. The script of creation is being written and revised at breakneck pace, but the ink beneath the melting ice runs red with both life and loss. Each new creature illuminates a possibility evolution may never have tried were it not for the crisis of thaw. And as the cold, ancient nursery becomes a hothouse of adaptation, those who observe can only marvel at the courage and terror with which nature embraces the unknown. The question that haunts every research vessel returning from the polar nurseries is not what these creatures are becoming, but how they are managing to transform so impossibly fast. Evolution, as we understand it, operates on timescales measured in millennia and millions of years, not decades and human lifetimes. Yet here, in the melting margins of the Arctic and Antarctic, organisms display adaptations that should require hundreds of thousands of generations to accumulate, appearing instead within a handful of breeding cycles. The answer, scientists are discovering, lies not in a single mechanism but in a convergence of processes that together act as evolutionary accelerants, each amplifying the others in ways that rewrite the rules of biological change. At the heart of this transformation is epigenetics, the chemical switching system that controls which genes are active and which lie dormant, waiting for the right conditions to awaken. Under extreme stress, organisms can flip these switches rapidly, activating ancient genetic programs that have been suppressed for eons, traits that once helped distant ancestors survive different worlds. This is not mutation in the traditional sense, but rather the unleashing of potential that already exists within the genome, hidden possibilities that emerge when environmental pressure becomes unbearable. Epigenetic changes operate through chemical modifications to DNA, particularly through a process called methylation, where molecules attach to genes and alter their expression without changing the underlying genetic code. In stable environments, methylation patterns remain relatively consistent across generations, maintaining the status quo of which genes are on and which are off. But in the chaos of melting polar oceans, where temperatures fluctuate wildly, salinity shifts with each influx of glacial meltwater, and light regimes swing between extremes, methylation patterns become unstable. Organisms experience what molecular biologists describe as epigenetic chaos, a breakdown of normal regulatory control that allows rapid, often dramatic changes in gene expression. A fish might activate genes for cold tolerance that its tropical ancestors used millions of years ago, or a crustacean might express developmental programs that produce radically different body plans within a single generation. What makes this particularly unsettling is that some of these epigenetic changes can be inherited, meaning that offspring are born with the switches already flipped, pre-adapted to conditions their parents struggled to survive. Evolution, in these circumstances, no longer waits patiently for beneficial mutations to appear randomly and spread slowly through populations. But epigenetics alone cannot explain the appearance of entirely novel genetic sequences, traits with no apparent ancestry in a species' lineage. For that, we must turn to horizontal gene transfer, a process more commonly associated with bacteria than with complex marine animals. In the melting ice, ancient microorganisms frozen for tens of thousands of years are being released in vast quantities, bringing with them viral particles that can act as genetic ferries between unrelated species. These viruses, evolved in prehistoric conditions, carry fragments of DNA from hosts long extinct, and when they infect modern organisms, they sometimes insert these genetic fragments into their new hosts' genomes. The result is a kind of genetic mosaic, creatures carrying genes from multiple sources stitched together in combinations that natural selection alone would never produce. A predatory fish might acquire antifreeze proteins not through millions of years of gradual adaptation, but through a viral infection that delivers the complete genetic blueprint from an ice-adapted bacterium. The implications are staggering. The melting poles are not just changing the environment, they are fundamentally altering the genetic landscape, creating opportunities for evolutionary leaps that would otherwise be impossible. The viral shuttles operating in polar waters represent one of the most bizarre and terrifying aspects of this forced evolution. Ancient ice cores from Greenland and Antarctica contain viral particles that have remained viable after being frozen for over 30,000 years, preserved in a state of suspended animation. As the ice melts, these viruses enter the water column and begin infecting contemporary organisms, introducing genetic material from the Pleistocene era into modern genomes. Some researchers have documented fish carrying bacterial genes that originated before the last ice age, fragments of ancient DNA now functioning in creatures that have never encountered such conditions in their evolutionary history. The mixing is indiscriminate and chaotic, viruses transferring genes between bacteria and eukaryotes, between predators and prey, between organisms separated by hundreds of millions of years of evolutionary divergence. This is not the orderly, incremental change described in textbooks, but rather a biological free-for-all where the normal barriers between species and kingdoms have become permeable. In the ghost zones and nursery shelves, evolution is no longer just a process of refinement and optimization. It has become a wild experiment in genetic recombination on a scale never before witnessed. Microplastics, those ubiquitous pollutants that now permeate every ocean on Earth, play an unexpected and paradoxical role in this evolutionary drama. Far from being merely toxic, these tiny particles create unique microenvironments on their surfaces where bacteria, viruses, and single-celled organisms congregate in dense communities. Each plastic fragment becomes a floating island of genetic exchange, a place where horizontal gene transfer occurs at elevated rates due to the high density of organisms in close proximity. Marine creatures that ingest these particles, either deliberately or accidentally, expose themselves to intense doses of foreign DNA and viral vectors, increasing the probability of genetic incorporation. Some species have begun to show adaptations specifically related to microplastic digestion, developing gut bacteria capable of breaking down synthetic polymers, bacteria that may themselves carry genes acquired from the plastic-associated microbial communities. The irony is profound. Human pollution, one of the great drivers of environmental destruction, is also catalyzing evolutionary innovation in ways we are only beginning to understand. The Arctic waters, heavily contaminated with microplastics transported by ocean currents from industrial regions, have become inadvertent laboratories where evolution is accelerated by our own waste. The concept scientists now discuss in hushed, almost reverent tones is evolutionary facilitation through stress. The idea that extreme environmental disruption does not merely select for existing variation but actively generates new variation at accelerated rates. Organisms under severe stress experience elevated mutation rates as their DNA repair mechanisms become overwhelmed, but they also activate dormant genetic elements called transposons, fragments of DNA that can move around the genome and create new gene combinations. These jumping genes, normally suppressed by cellular machinery designed to maintain genomic stability, become active under extreme conditions, shuffling genetic material in ways that produce novel traits. Some of the bizarre morphologies appearing in polar organisms, structures that seem to blend features from multiple unrelated species, may be the result of transposon activity creating chimeric genes that code for hybrid proteins. The stress of rapid environmental change is not just killing off the unfit, it is fundamentally altering the genetic raw material available for natural selection to act upon. Evolution in these waters is not constrained by the slow accumulation of point mutations, but is instead turbocharged by multiple mechanisms all operating simultaneously. Perhaps most unsettling is the realization that what we are witnessing in the polar oceans may not be unique to these regions, but rather a preview of what could occur anywhere environmental conditions change rapidly enough. The mechanisms of epigenetic switching, horizontal gene transfer, and stress-induced mutation are not exclusive to ice-free Arctic waters. They are fundamental biological processes present in all organisms. What the melting poles provide is a perfect storm of conditions that activate all these mechanisms at once, creating a kind of evolutionary resonance where each process amplifies the others. If climate disruption continues to accelerate globally, will temperate and tropical oceans also become evolutionary hotspots, zones where the normal pace of change breaks down and organisms begin transforming with the same terrifying speed? The polar regions, in this view, are not isolated anomalies but rather early warning systems, showing us what happens when environmental stress pushes biological systems beyond their normal operating parameters. We have inadvertently turned the ocean into a planetary-scale evolutionary laboratory, and the experiments running in the polar waters suggest that the results will be both wondrous and monstrous. The question that emerges from this understanding is not whether evolution can keep pace with climate change. Clearly it can, at least for some organisms under some conditions. The real question is what kind of life will emerge from this crucible, and whether the ecosystems that result will bear any resemblance to those we know. The mechanisms driving rapid evolution in polar waters, epigenetics, viral gene transfer, transposon activation, microplastic-mediated exchange, are creating organisms that blur the boundaries of taxonomy and challenge our understanding of what a species even is. Are these creatures evolutionary experiments that will fail and disappear as quickly as they arose? Or are they the founders of entirely new lineages that will dominate future oceans? The melting ice has unleashed forces that were dormant for millions of years, ancient viruses mixing with modern DNA, stress activating genetic potential that never had reason to express itself before, and the result is a living laboratory where the future is being written in real time. What terrifies and fascinates in equal measure is the recognition that we have no control over the outcome, that evolution in these accelerated conditions is producing solutions we cannot predict or prevent. The polar oceans have become nature's most extreme experiment, and the only certainty is that the results will transform the living world in ways we are only beginning to imagine. Imagine standing at the edge of time, peering forward 50 years into an Arctic Ocean that bears no resemblance to the one we know today, where evolution has had half a century to explore the possibilities unleashed by melting ice. The water temperature has stabilized at levels 3 to 4 degrees warmer than present, creating conditions that no longer favor the specialists of the frozen past, but instead reward adaptability, size, and aggression. In this future ocean, entirely new trophic levels have emerged, ecological niches that did not exist in the icebound Arctic, but now flourish in the perpetually open waters. Predators unlike any living today patrol the depths, their bodies combining traits from multiple ancestral lineages in ways that suggest not gradual evolution but rapid, almost improvisational creation. These are not the descendants of polar cod and ringed seals, the ice-dependent species that once defined Arctic life, but rather the inheritors of chaos, organisms that thrived in the transitional decades when the old order collapsed and the new had not yet stabilized. What will these future oceans look like when the explosive phase of evolution subsides and new equilibria establish themselves? The answers emerging from predictive models and evolutionary projections paint a picture that is simultaneously wondrous and deeply unsettling. One of the most striking projections involves the return of gigantism to polar waters, a phenomenon not seen since the age of marine reptiles and ancient megasharks. Cold water holds more dissolved oxygen than warm water, and the combination of nutrient-rich currents, abundant food from algae blooms, and high oxygen saturation creates ideal conditions for organisms to grow to extraordinary sizes. Computer models suggest that by 2075, the Arctic could harbor filter-feeding organisms rivaling the size of blue whales, not mammals but massive invertebrates descended from jellyfish and salps, their translucent bodies spanning tens of meters as they drift through plankton-rich surface waters. Predatory fish, freed from the metabolic constraints of Ice Age survival, could reach lengths of 5 to 8 meters, apex hunters combining the speed of mackerel with the cold tolerance of polar cod and the sensory sophistication of deep-sea predators. Even crustaceans might participate in this gigantism, with projections showing possible lobster-like arthropods reaching masses of 40 to 50 kilograms, their armored bodies patrolling the seafloor in hunting packs. The mechanisms driving this size increase are well understood. Abundant food, high oxygen, stable conditions, and the removal of historical constraints that kept polar organisms small and conservative. Perhaps most intriguing are the projections of what researchers call Arctic reefs, structures that could dominate future polar shelves but would be composed of organisms entirely unlike tropical coral. These reefs would be built by massive sessile filter feeders, possibly descended from sea squirts or colonial tunicates, that secrete calcium-rich structures while feeding on the perpetual algae blooms sustained by nutrient-rich glacial runoff and extended daylight periods. Unlike coral reefs, which grow slowly over millennia, these Arctic reefs could establish themselves within decades, their rapid growth fueled by the same accelerated biological processes driving evolution throughout the polar oceans. The reefs would create three-dimensional habitat complexity in waters that were previously flat, featureless ice-scoured plains, providing attachment points for algae, shelter for smaller organisms, and hunting grounds for predators. Models suggest these structures could reach heights of 10 to 20 meters, forming underwater forests that rival kelp in their ecological importance. The reefs themselves might be bioluminescent, their surfaces glowing with symbiotic bacteria, creating ghostly illuminated cities in the polar darkness. Whether such structures would stabilize the ecosystem or create new instabilities remains an open question. The projection that generates the most debate among evolutionary biologists involves hybrid superpredators, organisms that combine traits from multiple species in ways that create entirely new hunting strategies and ecological roles. Imagine a creature with the streamlined body of a large fish, the grasping appendages of a cephalopod, and the electroreceptive sensing of a shark, all packaged in an organism that can tolerate both surface and deep water, warm currents and cold, light and darkness. Such chimeric predators sound like science fiction, but the mechanisms producing them, horizontal gene transfer, hybridization in stressed populations, rapid selection in unstable environments, are all documented in today's polar oceans. Given 50 years of continued disruption and evolutionary experimentation, the emergence of organisms that blur the boundaries between traditional taxonomic groups seems not just possible but probable. These superpredators might dominate the Arctic food web by virtue of their versatility, able to exploit multiple prey types and habitats in ways that specialized predators cannot. They would represent not just a new species but potentially a new mode of being, organisms that have transcended the usual constraints of evolutionary lineage. Temperature stratification in future polar oceans could create distinct ecological zones stacked vertically in the water column, each with its own characteristic fauna and distinct evolutionary pressures. The surface layer, warm and bright during the endless summer, might host fast-moving, visually oriented predators and vast blooms of photosynthetic organisms. Below this, a transition zone where temperature drops rapidly could be patrolled by ambush predators adapted to the boundary, organisms that can move between layers to exploit prey from both zones. The deep water, still cold and dark, might remain the domain of species more similar to current polar fauna, holdouts that survive the disruption by retreating to the last cold refuges. This vertical stratification would create opportunities for specialization, but also for organisms capable of moving between zones, supergeneralists that can follow prey through different habitats. The result would be an ocean of unprecedented complexity, where depth matters as much as latitude in determining what lives where. Scientists projecting these futures struggle to predict how many species such an ocean could support, whether diversity would explode or collapse under the weight of instability. One of the more unsettling projections involves the potential breakdown of traditional predator-prey relationships and their replacement by more chaotic, opportunistic feeding strategies. In ecosystems undergoing rapid change, specialists often lose out to generalists, organisms that can eat a variety of foods and adapt their behavior to changing conditions. Future Arctic predators might abandon fixed hunting strategies in favor of behavioral flexibility, switching between active pursuit, ambush, scavenging, and even filter feeding depending on what resources are available. This kind of extreme omnivory is rare in modern oceans but could become the dominant strategy in an environment where predictability has been replaced by constant flux. Imagine an ocean where the distinction between herbivore, carnivore, and scavenger becomes meaningless, where organisms consume whatever they encounter and adapt their digestive systems in real time through gut microbiome manipulation. Such an ecosystem would be incredibly resilient to further disruption, because no single species would depend on any other, but it would also lack the elegant trophic structure that characterizes stable marine environments. The resulting food web would resemble not a pyramid but a tangled network, with energy flowing in unpredictable directions. The question that haunts these projections is whether the organisms emerging from this evolutionary crucible represent a genuine new beginning or merely a brief flourish before inevitable collapse. Are we witnessing the birth of a vibrant, resilient Arctic ecosystem adapted to the new reality, or are these creatures evolutionary dead ends, temporary solutions to conditions that will themselves shift again before stable adaptations can consolidate? Some models suggest that after the initial explosive phase of adaptation, a more stable ecosystem will emerge, with clear trophic levels and predictable energy flows reestablished. Other projections show continued instability, perpetual cycles of boom and bust as organisms overshoot carrying capacity, exhaust resources, and crash, only to be replaced by the next wave of opportunists. The truth may lie somewhere between, an ocean that achieves temporary equilibria lasting decades before external forces, continued warming, changing currents, ocean acidification, disrupt the balance once again. What is certain is that the Arctic of 2075 or 2100 will be an ocean transformed, bearing perhaps some superficial resemblance to productive temperate seas but fundamentally different in its constituent life forms and evolutionary dynamics. Standing at the threshold of this unwritten future, we confront a profound question about the nature of evolution itself and our role in shaping it. The creatures that will inhabit future polar oceans are being created right now, in the chaotic present where ice melts and ecosystems shatter, where ancient viruses mix with modern DNA and organisms adapt or perish within single lifetimes. We have become, whether intentionally or not, the architects of evolutionary pressure on a scale unprecedented in Earth's history, our climate disruption forcing life to innovate at breakneck speed or face extinction. The Arctic Ocean has become our unintentional laboratory, and the experiments running there will determine not just the future of polar life, but the trajectory of evolution in all the world's oceans as warming spreads and disruption becomes the new normal. What emerges from the melting ice may be beautiful beyond imagining. Organisms of stunning complexity and adaptation that exploit opportunities we cannot yet envision. Or it may be monstrous, life stripped down to its most opportunistic and aggressive forms, ecosystems perpetually unstable and dominated by chaos. Most likely, it will be both. A future ocean that inspires equal measures of wonder and dread, where the line between miracle and catastrophe remains forever blurred. The ice held these waters frozen in time for millennia, but now the clock is ticking faster than evolution has ever moved before, and in the polar oceans, the future is arriving decades ahead of schedule, whether we are ready or not.